So, for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the film Love and Mercy, which portrays Brian Wilson at two different points in his life during the 1960s and during the 1980s. So, I came to the conclusion that this film is a biography because my definition of a biography is that not every little detail has to be correct, so long as the overall essence of the person is portrayed correctly. They're portrayed as how they would act in real life, and their relationships with other significant people in their lives are portrayed as real in the film. Um, so to come to this conclusion, I did a little bit of research first on Brian Wilson and the background of the filming um, of the biopic. And Brian Wilson himself, he didn't have any involvement with the film, but he did say that the film was very factual and how it portrayed his mental illness in the 1980s and the recording of Pet Sounds in the 1960s. So I also researched how Paul Dano and John Cusack portrayed him, because they portrayed him at two different time periods. And the point of this movie is to portray him almost as if he were two different people. So Paul Dano and John Cusack both did not talk to each other during the filming of the movie, so that they could come up with their own ways of how to portray him. And John Cusack said that when Brian Wilson himself was talking about how he was when he was recording Pet Sounds, when he was talking about his younger self, he was very disconnected from that person and talked about his younger self almost as if it were somebody entirely different. So I think that was a really big point of the film, was to kind of contrast Brian Wilson in the 1960s and Brian Wilson in the 1980s, and I think the film does a very good job of that. There's also some little things that they did throughout the film. For example, they recreated studio footage that it's on YouTube that you can find. They recreated it for the film, and they also recreated the Sloop John B promo film, which kind of adds a little bit of authenticity. If you're familiar with the Beach Boys, you might recognize some of the clips that are shown in the film. Another thing that I found really interesting was the introduction to the film, which starts in the 1960s, and it plays very classic Beach Boys songs, which gives kind of a good introduction to the 1960s surf scene that the Beach Boys were involved with and that they tried to capture with their music. And I think that the 1960s part of the film is mainly the musical aspect of the film, as it shows Brian's artistic side as he is recording Pet Sounds, and there's a lot of studio footage that shows him in doing all these revolutionary things that no one had really done before with music. And it shows his impact that he had on music and also on his personality. There's a scene at minute 27 where someone is saying to him, "Brian, this doesn't make sense. Are you sure? Did you mess up?" And he says, "It works in my head." And it kind of shows his personality and how he could just kind of come up with music and it worked for him. And the 80s part of the film is more the visual aspect of the film, and that also focuses on his mental illness. But I don't think that music was completely necessary for this part of the film, as that wasn't the main focus. It was on a completely different part of his life. And it also shows how he is essentially two different people, but there's a scene where he's playing the piano for his wife, Melinda Ledbetter, and he says that he came up with it right when he saw her, and I felt like that kind of showed, even though he is this completely different person in the 1980s, he still has that part of himself. He still has the ability to create music pretty much on the spot, that artistic ability that he had before. And I also thought that the use of sound was interesting to portray his deteriorating mental state. Around minute 59, he is recording a session for Pet Sounds, and he puts on headphones and he hears voices. And that is kind of the beginning of how he got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that's the beginning of his mental illness. So to conclude, I think that this movie is a biography because of the way that it portrays Brian Wilson at two different points in his life. I think that it was a very good stylistic choice on the director's part to use two different actors to kind of create two different people during the 1960s and the 1980s. And I think that the music, especially the recording of Pet Sounds, really helped to develop his character in the 1960s.